Listen carefully, because this is a story England tried to bury. A story whispered only in the corners of medieval chronicles, where truth hides behind superstition. Imagine a quiet village. The year is somewhere in the 12th century. The air heavy with the scent of harvested wheat, and then not ordinary screams, but the shrill cries of children who should not exist. Woolpit, a tiny village surrounded by wolf pits, designed to trap predators, becomes the stage for a mystery that would unsettle Europe for centuries. Two children, ragged, terrified, and green. Their skin was not pale like the villagers', not sunburnt from the fields, but green, like leaves soaked in shadow. They spoke no English, wore strange metallic clothing, and refused all food except raw beans they pulled from the ground with shaking hands. The villagers stood frozen, their crosses clutched tight, fearing witchcraft or demons. And you, if you had been there, you would have felt it too, because these children did not belong. They looked human, yes, but not completely. The chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, would later write about them as if describing a riddle sent by God himself, a warning no one understood. The boy, younger and weaker, wasted away, starving despite the beans he devoured, as if his body was not meant for this world. The girl, stronger, survived and eventually spoke enough English to tell a story, one that should have been impossible. She claimed she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a world of perpetual twilight where everything was green, even the people. Her words sent shivers through the church scribes, because if she told the truth, then there was another world beneath theirs, hidden, forbidden, and terrifying. Was this a crime against nature? A forgotten experiment? A punishment from God? The villagers were left with more questions than answers, their faith shaken, their world suddenly wider, darker, and more dangerous. And here is where we begin, not with an answer, but with a rupture. Something crossed over into our world that day, and England has never been able to explain it. Tonight, we dig where no one dares to dig, into the soil of Woolpit, and we ask the questions that scared even the priests to silence. The story should have ended with curiosity, a strange footnote in medieval history, but Woolpit would not be allowed to sleep. The villagers had buried the boy in silence, no priest daring to give a sermon over a body so unnatural. His grave was shallow, unmarked, as if the earth itself might spit him out. The girl, now alone, was watched constantly by the church and the local lord's men. She was cleaned, baptized, dressed in linen, and yet the green would not leave. Her skin it only faded slowly over months, as if something was being drained from her. And when she began to speak more fluently, her story grew darker. St. Martin's Land, she said, was not a paradise. It was a place where people lived in fear, where a strange light glowed dimly like dusk, and where a constant sound like bells, like iron rang in the air. She said she and her brother had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a great noise, like a tunnel opening, and suddenly they found themselves here, blinded by the violent sunlight. The villagers recoiled. What tunnel? What noise? She could not explain. Some said she was speaking of purgatory. Others said she was a changeling, a fairy child left to lure humans into sin. But there were whispers, quiet, dangerous whispers, that perhaps these children were not sent by heaven or hell, but by men. The 12th century was an age of crusades and secret experiments. Scholars in monasteries dabbled with alchemy, philosophers argued about hidden worlds, and rulers hungered for ways to control populations. Could these children have been part of something forbidden human trials, kept far underground. Could there have been a hidden society beneath England, its existence known only to the powerful? The Lord of Woolpit, Sir Richard de Colin, kept the girl close, raising her within his household, but also questioning her relentlessly. His records of those interrogations have never been found, suggesting they were destroyed or hidden. What truth did she tell him that he feared would destroy his name? And why, years later, did her story vanish from official church chronicles, surviving only in the margins of two historians' manuscripts? The crime here is not just the boy's death, is the erasure of knowledge. Someone decided that what happened in Woolpit was not for the common people to know, and that decision has echoed for centuries. This is no longer a strange fairy tale. This is a cover dash up. Richard de Colin's manor became the girl's cage, though the chronicles will not call it that. They will say she was raised in his household, given Christian instruction, and treated with kindness. But kindness is a word used by the powerful to disguise ownership. Imagine her an orphan in a foreign land, her skin still faintly tinted, forced to eat food that felt strange in her mouth, surrounded by men in chainmail and priests with cold eyes. She was no longer merely a curiosity. She was evidence, and evidence must be controlled. The Lord questioned her, yes, but the churchmen did too. Scribes, scratching in the candlelight, recording everything she said about her green world. Did they believe her? Or did they fear her knowledge might spread? In the 1100s, knowledge was not free, it was dangerous. The girl spoke of tunnels, of passageways, of a place where the sun never shone, and where strange beings, her people, worked in silence. She said there were many like her and her brother, that their world stretched far and wide under the earth. And this was where the church's fear turned into strategy. If there was indeed a subterranean world, then it was either heresy or opportunity. Imagine the power in knowing there were lands untouched by Christendom, entire populations to convert, control, or use. But the girl would not give them everything. She became silent, guarded, her eyes wary. Perhaps she understood that whatever she said would be used against her people. Perhaps she began to hate the surface world that had taken her brother's life. Some accounts say she grew wanton and loose in adulthood. But this is the language of men trying to discredit a woman they cannot control. What if her rebellion was simply refusal to break? What if she knew too much? Richard de Colin eventually married her to a man in nearby King's Lynn, but that may have been less a marriage and more a transfer of custody. She was never allowed to leave England, never allowed to return to St. Martin's Land. Was she truly free, or was she kept close so the secret could never escape? And here is where the crime deepens: not the death of a boy, not the arrival of two strangers, but the possibility that England found a door to another world and slammed it shut. Someone made sure that whatever truth she carried died with her, locked away with her bloodline. As if Woolpit had swallowed the secret whole. Woolpit was no isolated village. In history it sat at the crossroads of power in 12th century England. A kingdom bleeding from civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda. Every scrap of information, every rumor, every anomaly could be used as a weapon in that political battlefield. The appearance of two children with green skin was not just a curiosity, was a potential omen, a sign from God, or worse, from the devil. Both sides in the Civil War would have wanted to control the narrative, and control it they did. The church began framing the story as a miracle of conversion. Strange pagan children baptized, purified, and brought into the light of Christ. But beneath the holy language is something far more chilling. What if the girl was being used as propaganda? a living symbol to remind the peasants that even creatures from below could be saved, so they too must obey the church. This is how psychological control worked in the Middle Ages, through fear and awe, through stories designed to shape behavior. Yet there is something that doesn't fit: the girl's insistence on the tunnels, on the strange sound that led them to the surface. That detail was dangerous. It hinted at an entire world outside the reach of kings and bishops, and such an idea could destabilize their grip on power. Imagine if the serfs learned there was a place beyond England, beyond taxes, beyond the authority of the sword, a place they could flee to. That idea alone could ignite rebellion. And so, those details were quietly minimized, written only in the margins of rare manuscripts, while the miracle version of the story was pushed to the forefront. What we are seeing is the first layer of institutional censorship. Knowledge that could liberate was reshaped into knowledge that could control. And this is why the Green Children are more than a quaint folk tale. They are a case study in how history is engineered. Someone, somewhere, decided what part of their story would survive and what part would vanish into silence. The crime is widening now. It is no longer just a cover-up, it is an act of narrative domination. The first step in turning to lost children into a myth that serves the ruling order. This is not just Woolpit's secret anymore. This is England's secret. The green was never just a curiosity, it was a signature. Chroniclers described it as if the children's very blood had been altered, as if something in them had been forged in a place no one dared to go. Modern theories try to tame it, suggesting chlorosis, a kind of iron deficiency common among the malnourished. But this is too easy, too neat. Two children, both afflicted identically, both arriving from nowhere, both surviving on beans, alone it does not add up. What if the green was not a sickness, but a clue? Medieval England was a place of secret learning, where alchemists in hidden rooms experimented with metals, minerals, and even human bodies, seeking the philosopher's stone, seeking ways to transmute not just gold, but life itself. Could the children have been part of such an experiment? In monasteries, monks studied the effects of diet and fasting on the human soul, believing certain foods could purify or corrupt. What if somewhere, far underground, a community existed that had adapted fitly, biologita survive on the sparse foods of the subterranean world? What if their greenness was the mark of that adaptation? And then imagine this. What if someone had found them before Woolpit did crusaders, returning from strange lands? Scholars dabbling with forbidden tunnels and had taken them, studied them, and then somehow lost them, allowing them to escape to the surface. This is where the story edges closer to a crime of science, the kind of crime that leaves no witnesses, no records. Only the bodies of two frightened children stumbling into a hostile world. The girl's gradual loss of her green tint could be seen as a forced transformation, her body forced to adapt to sunlight. New foods, new air, perhaps painfully. Was this the real reason her brother died? Not starvation, but shock. His body unable to withstand the violence of being torn from his environment. The villagers saw this as divine judgment, but perhaps it was just biology pushed beyond its limit. If this is true, then the crime of Woolpit is a crime against a people we barely know, a lost race, perhaps extinct now, who were dragged into our world and erased. This is where the mystery becomes personal, because it forces us to ask, how many secrets has history buried in shallow, unmarked graves? And how many of those secrets still bleed under the soil, waiting for someone to dig them up? Legends of hidden worlds are older than Woolpit. In every culture, from the Norse to the Greeks to the Celts. There are whispers of people who live below, creatures of the hollow hills, the underworld, the other side. Medieval England called them fae, elves, or the good folk, but these were not glittering Disney sprites. They were feared, unpredictable, powerful. Farmers left offerings at the edges of forests, not out of devotion, but to keep them away. And here, in Woolpit, the legends took on flesh. 2 children with green skin walking into a village was no story. It was a confrontation with the myth. But what if the myth was based on reality? Hollow Earth theories sound fantastical now, but to a 12th century mind they were entirely plausible. Chroniclers believed in vast caverns under the earth, full of strange races and hidden kingdoms. If the girl's testimony is true, St. Martin's Land was one of those places, dim, perpetual twilight, and inhabited by beings not entirely like us. And here is where the church and the crown had to make a choice. Do they acknowledge that such a world exists and risk shattering their monopoly on truth? Or do they suppress it, call it heresy, and quietly absorb the survivors into the Christian fold? They chose suppression because power cannot tolerate rivals. And this is why the Green Children story feels incomplete, as if pages have been torn from a book. Where are the church records of the girl's baptism? Where are the manorial records of her marriage? Where are the bones of her brother, or the place where he was buried? Everything about this case feels like it has been half-erased, as though Woolpit was allowed to keep the legend but not the evidence. And think about this. Woolpit was famous even before the children appeared for its wolf pits. Deep traps designed to capture dangerous predators alive. What if the village was not chosen by accident? What if the children were meant to be caught like wolves? What if Woolpit was a net, a place where the surface world could collect whatever rose from below? This is where the story stops being a simple curiosity and becomes something predatory. Someone was watching those tunnels. Someone was waiting. And someone made sure we only have fragments, just enough to wonder, never enough to know. The girl's survival was no accident. It was a process. The church and Sir Richard de Colin did not simply feed her, clothe her, and let her live. They reshaped her. This was medieval psychological conditioning long before the term existed. First came isolation, removing her from the fields, from the villagers who might have sympathized with her, placing her in the manor where every glance, every word was controlled. Then came the ritual of baptism, not just a religious act, but a public stripping of identity, a declaration that whatever she was before no longer existed. The girl who once belonged to St. Martin's Land was gone. In her place stood a Christian subject, bound by the rules of her new masters. But did they succeed in breaking her completely? Some records describe her as melancholic at first, silent, refusing to eat anything except beans, clinging to the only piece of her old life she could still control. This resistance would have been seen as rebellion, even danger, and the pressure to make her conform must have been relentless. Imagine the interrogations, the priests demanding she repeat prayers, the Lord demanding she recount her story again and again until it matched what he wanted to hear. Over time, she adapted, yes, but was it acceptance or was it survival? There is an important clue here. Chroniclers note that she eventually became wanton and loose as an adult. This is not a neutral statement. It's character assassination, the medieval way of saying she became unruly, uncontrollable, perhaps even defiant. What if her so-called immorality was actually her refusal to fully submit, her attempt to reclaim her autonomy in a world that had taken everything from her? And yet, They kept her close, even after she married, as if her existence was too dangerous to let out of sight. This is psychological control as much as it is physical. The girl became both prisoner and warning, a living artifact of a forbidden world, held up as proof that such a world could be tamed. This is the deeper crime, more sinister than the boy's unmarked grave, the breaking of a mind, the rewriting of a person's identity until she could no longer speak for herself. And yet, the traces of her old self survived, hidden in the margins of history, waiting for someone to listen, to understand Woolpit. You must understand the world it lived in, a world burning with holy wars. The 12th century was the age of the Crusades, when kings, popes, and knights declared that God demanded conquest, demanded blood, demanded obedience. Every miracle, every sign, every strange occurrence was seized and twisted to serve that machine. The Green Children were no exception. The church could not allow their story to remain merely strange. It had to become useful, and so the narrative shifted. The girl was cast as a heathen child, baptized into salvation, proof that even the most alien could be brought into the light of Christ. Imagine the sermons preached. If God could convert the green-skinned children from beneath the earth, then you, the peasant, had no excuse to disobey, no excuse to doubt, no excuse to rebel. Fear was the weapon, and fear worked best when wrapped in wonder. But there is another layer. Here control through scarcity. The girl's diet of beans, her brother's death from what they called starvation, may not have been natural events. What if they were deliberate trials, tests to see how these strangers would respond to deprivation, to control of food supply? This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Medieval lords routinely used famine as a tool to keep peasants submissive, hoarding grain in their castles while villagers starved. The girl may have been their first experiment in cross-world subjugation, proof that even a being from another land could be broken by hunger. And when she finally began to eat their bread, their meat, their food, it was not just nourishment tip, was assimilation. Her body changed, her skin lost its green, she became one of them. This is power at its most insidious, the ability to remake not just a mind but a body until it belongs to the master. And the peasants who watched would have learned the lesson: resist, and you will starve. Submit, and you will live. The Green Children thus became a story not of mystery, but of warning, parable that reinforced the hierarchy of church and lord over commoner. And yet, something about it still escaped their grasp. Because the girl's words about St. Martin's Land survived, even if faintly. She planted a seed of forbidden knowledge, and once planted, it cannot be unlearned. If St. Martin's Land was real, then it posed the greatest threat imaginable to medieval power, a place beyond their reach. The girl described it as a land of twilight, a place where the sun never shone, but where life still thrived, fields of strange crops, people who spoke a language unknown to England, a constant sound in the air like church bells. This was not the afterlife. This was geography, and geography could be mapped, invaded, conquered. The church would have heard those words and seen not a curiosity, but an opportunity and a danger. A hidden population meant untaxed laborers, unbaptized souls, an entire world that owed nothing to the crown or the cross. If the peasants ever learned that such a place existed, they might dream of escape, of a world where they were free of feudal obligations. That dream could shatter kingdoms. So St. Martin's Land had to be erased, or at least turned into a fable. It is telling that no subsequent attempts to find it were ever recorded, not by priests, not by lords, not by wandering scholars. Are we to believe that a medieval society that launched entire wars over rumors of the Holy Grail did not even send scouts to search for a hidden land within England itself? No. The more likely answer is that someone did search and what they found was deemed too dangerous to reveal. Perhaps the tunnels were sealed. Perhaps those who found them never returned. Or perhaps, worst of all, they found the place and destroyed it, erasing an entire people so that no threat to the established order would remain. This is why the Green Children story is so disturbing. It is not just the story of two children found in a field. It is the last cry of a world that may no longer exist. And here is where the crime becomes generational. If St. Martin's Land was real and its people were wiped out or forced to assimilate, then the girl we read about in the Chronicles is not a miracle story. She is a survivor, the last witness to a genocide that has been hidden under centuries of pious language and village legend. That is why her story matters. It is not folklore. It is testimony. History is not a record of what happened, is a record of what was allowed to be remembered. The story of the Green Children is the perfect example of how the powerful curate memory. Look at the sources. Only two chroniclers, writing decades apart, mentioned them at all. Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, both clerics, both writing for educated audiences, recorded just enough to intrigue, never enough to prove. Where are the parish records of the burial? Where are the manorial ledgers that should list two strange dependents taken into Richard de Colin's household? These were meticulous documents, and yet, here, there is silence. Silence is not absence. Silence is a decision. The ruling order decided which details would be kept and which would be allowed to rot. And that silence is a kind of murder of truth. It forces us to become detectives centuries later, piecing together a crime scene from scraps. And that is exactly what we are doing now. But here's the danger. When you begin to pull at threads like this, you will be told to stop. You will be told it is just folklore, just fairy tale, just a harmless village myth. You will be told not to take it seriously, because if you do, you might start asking questions that cannot be contained. Who benefits from erasing the story of St. Martin's Land? Who decided the boy's grave would be left unmarked? That the girl's testimony would be minimized? That the very memory of a possible hidden world would be recast as a quaint curiosity? Someone did, and their descendants, their institutions, may still sit in positions of power today. This is what makes the Green Children more than a medieval mystery. They are a warning about how easily entire worlds can vanish, not just physically, but now. And you must ask yourself, what else has been erased? What other histories lie buried under polite church language and rewritten chronicles? When you feel that chill as you listen to this story, it is not just fear, it is recognition. You are brushing against a truth you were never meant to hold, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is why stories like this survive in whispers, in folk memory, in the margins of books, because some truths refuse to stay buried. No matter how deep the pit, what if Woolpit was not the end of the story, but the beginning? The chronicles fall silent after the girl's adulthood, but silence does not mean the thread was cut. Imagine this: a child raised under surveillance, married off but never allowed to leave, her bloodline kept close and watched for generations. This is how secrets are contained, not by destroying them, but by breeding them into obedience. There are local legends that speak of families in Suffolk who claim descent from a strange woman, whose skin had once been green. Are these merely tales, or are they echoes of a bloodline that still carries whatever marked her as different. And if that bloodline still exists, what might it mean? In every age, rulers have been obsessed with bloodlines, from kings tracing royal ancestry to secret societies tracking initiates. What if the Green Girl's descendants were monitored, protected, or even used by those in power? It would not be the first time. History is full of examples of individuals who were studied not for what they knew, but for what they were. And this is where the conspiracy tightens. Woolpit was near important medieval trade routes, near monasteries that were centers of secret learning. Any unusual phenomenon would have been reported, investigated, and if St. Martin's Land was a real place, the church could have sealed its entrances and kept that knowledge under lock and key. And if it was sealed, who is to say it has remained sealed? There are modern reports buried in obscure publications of strange tunnels, of sounds underground, of sightings of pale, light-sensitive people near abandoned mines. Are these coincidences, or is the story of the Green Children still unfolding, hidden beneath the surface of England's countryside? This is where the danger becomes personal. If you are hearing this now, you are part of a chain of knowledge that was meant to be broken. They did not want you to wonder, to investigate, to follow the trail. And yet here you are, descending with me into the dark. If you are still watching, I want you to prove you are not afraid. Comment below. The soil remembers. Type it twice. Let everyone know you are part of those who dig for the truth, no matter how deep they have to go. The Middle Ages were an age of fear disguised as faith. The church hunted heresy with the same zeal it waged holy war, burning men alive for speaking truths that threatened their monopoly on salvation. And this is the world the Green Girl grew up in. Once she learned to speak their language, once she could tell her story in words they understood, she became dangerous. Knowledge is power, and forbidden knowledge is dynamite in the wrong hands. What she carried in her memory details about a hidden land, about a people who lived beyond the reach of the crown could spark dissent. It is not impossible that the church used her story selectively, turning it into a cautionary tale to frighten peasants, while at the same time suppressing anything that might encourage hope or rebellion. This is the pattern of power. Take what serves you, burn what does not. But there is an even darker possibility that they did not simply suppress her knowledge, but exploited it. If St. Martin's Land was real, her words could have been used to locate entrances, to map tunnels, to hunt down her people. She may have been interrogated, not for the sake of understanding, but for the sake of conquest. Think about that. A girl torn from her home, forced to guide her captors back to the very world they came from, a living key to a kingdom they could plunder. This is how empire works: turn the victim into the instrument of their own people's destruction. And when she had served her purpose, when the tunnels were sealed or the population subdued, she was allowed to live but not to speak freely. Her later reputation as wanton may have been the result of her defiance, her refusal to carry their narrative any longer. The chronicles call it moral corruption, but perhaps it was moral clarity, understanding that the church and the Lord who raised her were not saviors but jailers. And here is the truth no one wants to face. Woolpit may not have been a miracle of conversion. It may have been an invasion, the first skirmish in a hidden war that was never written down. The Green Girl was not just a survivor. She may have been the last witness to a conquest that ended before it ever began. Now we move to one of the most horrifying events ever hidden in plain sight. A day when an entire city street turned into a river of death. This is not a myth. It happened in Boston, 1919, and it left behind a scene so gruesome that survivors would never forget it. What you're about to hear is not just a disaster, it's a crime, a cover-up, and a warning that still echoes a century later. Listen closely, because this is a story no one ever meant for you to hear. It begins with a sound like thunder, but came from no storm. The people of Boston heard it on January 15th, 1919, a deep, groaning roar that rolled through the city like the opening of hell's own gates. In the North End, families eating lunch froze mid-bite. Horses panicked. Workers looked up from the docks just in time to see the impossible. A shining, black wall rising higher than a man, then higher than a house. It wasn't water. It wasn't fire. It was molasses thick, dark, unstoppably moving at 35 miles an hour. A sweet, suffocating tsunami that would kill without mercy. 21 would die. 150 would be crushed, drowned, or trapped in a nightmare so absurd that newspapers would call it an accident. But was it? You are about to descend with me into a forgotten crime. One written off as an industrial mishap, but smelling of corporate greed, government complicity, and a cover-up so successful most people today think this story is just a joke. It wasn't a joke for the children who suffocated. It wasn't a joke for the workers whose bones were broken, for the firefighters who died at their post, or for the people whose bodies were never truly recovered. You see, disasters don't just happen. Someone builds them. Someone profits from them. Someone decides that cutting corners, ignoring warnings, and silencing dissent is cheaper than doing what's right. The Purity Distilling Company built the tank that killed Boston. They filled it with 2.3 million gallons of fermenting molasses in the dead of winter, ignoring every sign that the rivets were failing, ignoring neighbors' warnings that the tank groaned and leaked. They turned a neighborhood into a bomb, and when it went off, they acted shocked. But this wasn't just negligence. This was the cost of ambition. This was the price of a country drunk on industry, a system that told corporations they could do anything so long as profits flowed. I'm not just telling you about a flood. I'm telling you about the day an entire city learned that the powerful would rather watch you drown than lose a dime. And this, my friend, is only the beginning. When the tank exploded, it did not merely burst, it detonated. Witnesses described hearing a metallic scream, like the shriek of a dying animal, before the tank ripped apart with the force of a bomb. Steel plates shot through the air like shrapnel. The ground trembled. In seconds, an entire neighborhood became a killing field. The wave was 15 feet high, black and glistening, moving with the weight of a freight train. People were hurled against buildings, crushed under carts, swallowed whole. Horses drowned in place, thrashing until the syrup pulled them under. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and rotting at the same time, and it clung to everything's skin, hair, clothing, even the air. It was chaos, but here's where it gets darker. Survivors swore that the company knew this was coming. The tank had been leaking for months, dripping molasses down its sides so often that children collected it in cups. Locals said the metal walls groaned on warm days, expanding and popping like something alive. But Purity Distilling ignored the complaints. They had a schedule to meet. The molasses was destined to become industrial alcohol, feeding the war machine and Prohibition-era demand. Time was money. Safety was an afterthought. And so the people of the North End became collateral damage in a deal they never agreed to. What followed was not just a flood, but a nightmare cleanup operation where the city was forced to wash streets with salt water, sand, and fire hoses for weeks. The molasses seeped into the harbor, turning it brown for months. Corpses were dug from the sticky wreckage, some so mangled they were unrecognizable. And yet, before the bodies were even counted, the company's lawyers were at work, spinning a story. They said the explosion was an act of God. They said no one could have predicted this. They called it unforeseeable, unavoidable, a tragedy beyond human control. But the people knew better. They had been living with the warning signs every single day. They knew this wasn't fate. This was failure, and failure paid for in blood. If you think this is just a sad piece of trivia, stay with me, because what happened next exposed the machinery of power that still runs our world today. This was not just about molasses. This was about who gets to decide how much your life is worth. The investigation that followed was supposed to deliver justice, but what it really did was strip bare the soul of the system. For nearly 6 years, the victims' families and the survivors fought one of the longest court battles in Massachusetts history. Imagine this, over 100 lawsuits merged into one massive case, turning the tragedy into a war between working class, immigrants, and one of the most powerful industrial corporations of its time. The courtroom became a stage where every dark detail was dragged into the light. Expert witnesses testified that the steel tank was dangerously thin, barely half the thickness recommended for holding such a colossal weight of liquid. Engineers revealed that the tank had never been tested properly, no hydrostatic test, no real inspection, just filled and trusted to hold. And when it began to leak, the company's answer was not to repair it, but to paint the tank brown to hide the evidence. Let that sink in. They painted over the leaks, so no one would see. This wasn't just negligence, it was deception. The company tried to argue that anarchists had planted a bomb. Remember, this was 1919, the Red Scare was gripping America. Fear of radicals and revolutionaries was everywhere, and Purity Distilling used that fear to deflect blame. They wanted the public to think this was terrorism, not their incompetence. But as testimony piled up, their story began to crumble. The evidence showed a pattern: profits over safety, lies over truth, power over people. The judge who presided over the case sifted through thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of testimonies, and in the end, his decision was damning. The company was responsible. It had ignored the warnings, failed its duty, and unleashed death on an entire community. They were ordered to pay damages, around $1 million, roughly $16 million today. It was one of the first times in American history that a corporation of that size was forced to answer for killing civilians. But here's the part no one tells you. No one went to prison. Not one executive spent a day behind bars. The company simply absorbed the cost and moved on. Justice had a price tag, and once it was paid, the machine kept running. Ask yourself, what does that sound like? Because I'll tell you, it sounds exactly like the world we still live in. The North End never truly recovered. Even after the streets were scrubbed and the harbor turned back to blue, the air still carried that strange sweetness, that ghost of rot, as if the tragedy refused to leave. Survivors described molasses nightmares for years, dreams of running but not being able to move, of being buried alive in something thick and suffocating. Children who had seen their parents drown grew up with a terror of anything sticky, of floods, of dark liquids. Horses were gone, homes destroyed, livelihoods shattered. And yet, the world outside Boston treated it like a curiosity, a headline to chuckle over. The Molasses Flood became a joke in the papers, a macabre punchline. But those who lived through it knew there was nothing funny about what happened. Trauma lived in the walls, in the cobblestones, in the bloodlines of the families who stayed. Some left the neighborhood entirely, unable to pass the spot where the tank once stood. The tank itself was never rebuilt, dismantled piece by piece, as if erasing the evidence could erase the crime. But there's something more chilling here, because when you look at the photographs of the aftermath, the twisted steel, the broken bodies, the dark tide line still staining the brick walls, you see something familiar. You see the blueprint of every modern disaster that followed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the Buffalo Creek flood, Bhopal, Flint. We live in a world built on the same equation, risk weighed against profit, with your life as the collateral. And when disaster strikes, the pattern repeats: shock, denial, spin, payout, silence. The North End learned that lesson a century ago. That's why I'm telling you this story now. Because it's history, but because it's prophecy. Look closely at the pictures, at the faces of the people standing knee-deep in molasses. They are not just mourning the dead. They are staring directly into the camera, directly at you, across time, as if to say, this will happen again, because you have not stopped them. This is where the descent begins to feel personal, because you can't unhear this. You can't unknow what they tried to hide. And once you see the system for what it is, you can never look away again. What came next was not just cleanup hits, was narrative control. The Purity Distilling Company and its parent corporation, U.S. Industrial Alcohol, went to work shaping the story. They had money, lawyers, newspapers, and politicians in their pocket. The goal was simple: make the disaster seem like a freak accident, something no one could have foreseen, and most importantly, keep the public from seeing it as a crime. Articles appeared downplaying the suffering, focusing instead on the bizarre nature of the event. Boston drowned in molasses became a headline meant to amuse rather than outrage. Reporters described it as comical, as though the dead had slipped on syrup instead of being crushed under thousands of pounds of steel and sugar. This was psychological warfare. The company knew that if you can make a tragedy sound ridiculous, you strip it of its power to spark revolt. And the people, migrants, laborers, poor families were easy to silence. Who would believe them over the voice of industry? This is the part of the story that should haunt you, because it reveals the blueprint for how power rewrites reality. When the truth threatens to topple the system simply rewrites the truth. It floods the newspapers with jokes, distractions, counter-narratives, until the public forgets what really happened. And the public did forget. The Great Molasses Flood faded into the background of history, a bizarre anecdote taught in schools without its teeth. The names of the dead rarely get mentioned. Their suffering becomes trivia, not testimony. And this is where you must ask yourself how many other disasters, crimes, even atrocities have been hidden behind the curtain of humor or sensationalism. How many truths have been buried because someone with power decided you didn't need to know? The molasses flood was a warning shot, a moment where the mask slipped and we saw how cheaply human life could be valued. But most people didn't see it. Most people were too busy laughing. That is the brilliance of the cover-up. It doesn't just erase the past, it makes you complicit in forgetting it. And right now, as you hear this, you are standing at the edge of a choice. Do you look away like they want you to, or do you keep descending with me into the dark? The trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was psychological warfare between two worlds. On one side stood the working-class survivors of the North End. Many of them Italian immigrants who spoke little English, who had lost everything, whose family members. the only horses they owned to pull their carts. On the other side stood a corporation with deep pockets, powerful allies, and a vested interest in making sure this case did not set a precedent. This was more than a fight for compensation. It was a fight for truth itself. In the courtroom, the company's lawyers painted the victims as greedy, ungrateful, even dishonest, accusing them of exaggerating losses, suggesting that they were exploiting a tragedy for profit. They tried to discredit expert witnesses, to convince the judge that the tank failure was an unforeseeable act of fate. But evidence kept surfacing that told a darker story. The steel used in the tank was substandard, too brittle to hold the pressure, too thin for safety. The company had rushed construction to capitalize on wartime demand for industrial alcohol, ignoring the fact that proper tests were never performed. Witnesses testified that the tank made strange noises for months, groaning like an animal in pain, and that workers had been told to paint over the leaks so passers-by wouldn't notice. Each revelation was another crack in the corporate facade. Yet the battle dragged on for years, wearing down the families emotionally and financially. The company counted on that. They knew if they stretched the fight long enough, some claimants would give up, others would die before they ever saw justice. This is how power operates. Not by winning quickly, but by grinding you down until resistance feels pointless. And yet, the people didn't stop. They came back to court again and again, carrying the memory of the dead with them, refusing to let the story be buried under paperwork. Their persistence turned the trial into one of the most important early tests of corporate accountability in America. But ask yourself, why did it take 6 years? Why does it always take years of blood, sweat, and relentless struggle just to hold the powerful to the most basic level of responsibility? The answer is simple. The system was never built for you. It was built for them. And every step of this case revealed just how deep that design goes. Slowly, piece by piece, the tide began to turn. The courtroom became a battlefield where the truth clawed its way to the surface. Each witness who took the stand was another wound in the company's armor. Metallurgists proved that the steel was far too thin for the weight it held, that the tank had been built without proper safety margins, that cracks were inevitable. Neighbors described the sound of popping rivets, the hiss of escaping gas, the leaks that dripped molasses down the walls like tears. Every testimony painted the same picture. This was not a random disaster. It was a slow-motion murder carried out by greed and neglect. The judge listened to it, all thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours of testimony. And as the months dragged into years, the mask of the corporation began to slip. Their bomb theory, blaming anarchists, fell apart under scrutiny. No evidence of explosives was ever found. No witnesses heard any blast before the tank ruptured. What they called an act of God was now seen as an act of man, reckless, deliberate, preventable. For the families in the courtroom, this was more than a legal battle. It was a ritual of remembrance. Every time they walked through those doors, they brought their dead with them. They sat through testimony about how their children drowned, how their fathers were crushed, how their wives suffocated in darkness. They relived the nightmare because they refused to let it be erased. And here is where you, watching this right now, should feel the weight of what they did. These were ordinary people with no power, no influence, no voice, yet they forced one of the largest industrial companies in America to answer for what it had done. This was one of the first times in history that a corporation was found liable for mass death in a civilian setting. The ruling forced them to pay what was then considered a massive settlement, around $1 million, the equivalent of millions today. But more than the money, it set a precedent that corporations could be held accountable, that the system could bend under enough pressure, and yet no one went to prison. No one personally paid for the decisions that led to 21 deaths. The company simply cut the check, and life went on. That's the part that should leave you cold. Because if no one is ever punished, was there really justice at all? This is where the story stops being history and starts becoming a mirror. Because if you think the Great Molasses Flood was just some strange event from a century ago, you're missing the point. What happened in Boston in 1919 is happening now. Different product, different city, same machine. Corporations still cut corners. Governments still look the other way. When disaster strikes, they still call it unforeseeable. Still drag survivors through years of legal battles until they are too exhausted to fight. Think about every time a factory collapsed in Bangladesh, every time toxic water poisoned a town, every time a chemical spill turned a river black. Do you see the pattern yet? Boston was the rehearsal, the early script, the warning. And here's what chills me. We are more connected than ever, more informed than ever, and still most people look away. They laugh at the absurdity of molasses drowning a city, never realizing that laughing is exactly what those in power want them to do. Because when you laugh, you stop asking questions. And when you stop asking questions, you stop resisting. This is why I need you to be here with me, to descend deeper into this darkness. This is not just a story, it's a lesson in how the world really works. I want you to feel the weight of the molasses on your chest, to smell it, to hear the screams of the horses and the people as that wave rolled through their streets. That is the sound of a system that does not care about you, that sees you only as a cost on a ledger. If you are still here, you are not an average viewer. You are someone who wants to see the truth, no matter how heavy it gets. So do something with me right now. I want you to pause for just a moment and comment below. I see the black tide. Write it twice so it sinks in, so it becomes a symbol that you are not asleep, that you are not one of the ones laughing and forgetting. And then keep watching, because where we're going next is darker still. We are about to uncover how the state, the press, and the corporate machine worked together to make sure you never heard this story the way it really happened. The press was the first battlefield, and it was captured quickly. Newspapers are supposed to be the watchdogs of power, but in 1919, many of them were owned or influenced by the very industrialists who stood to lose everything if the truth came out. Coverage of the flood shifted almost overnight from outrage to amusement. Editorials described it as Boston's sweetest disaster, as if turning death into a clever headline could erase the cries of the dying. Reporters downplayed the negligence, focused on the strangeness, and made the victims seem like background characters in a spectacle. This wasn't random, it was strategic. The company knew that memory is malleable, that if they could get the public to think of the flood as something humorous, they could stop it from becoming a rallying cry. And it worked. Within months, what could have been an industrial scandal became a dark curiosity. School children would one day read about it with a smirk, never realizing they were being taught a sanitized version of corporate manslaughter. This is how power maintains control, might be erasing the past completely, but by distorting it until it no longer inspires anger. They turned the flood into entertainment, and entertainment is safe. It does not demand justice. It does not ignite rebellion. If you're watching this right now, I want you to think about the last time a tragedy trended online. How long did it take before the memes started? Before the hashtags turned into jokes? before the story disappeared under a pile of newer, shinier news. This is not just history, it's a pattern of control designed to keep you numb. In Boston, it worked so well that even today, most people don't know 21 died, that children suffocated, that firefighters were trapped and crushed. They just know the phrase molasses flood, and they laugh. But laughter is the final stage of forgetting, and forgetting is exactly what they want. And here's the most chilling part. The moment a society forgets the crimes committed against it, those crimes can be committed again. That's why we're here, tearing this story back into the light. Because if you forget this one, you'll miss the next one. And the next one will not come as molasses. For years after the flood, it was the survivors who kept the memory alive quietly, stubbornly, against the tide of forgetfulness. They told their children what had happened, even when the newspapers mocked them, even when the city wanted to move on. They marked the anniversaries in hushed tones, visiting the spots where their loved ones had died. Some refused to ever forgive the company, carrying their bitterness like a weapon until the day they died. That bitterness was not weakness, it was fuel. It was their way of resisting the erasure of what had been done to them. And in a way, they succeeded. Because even though the nation forgot, Boston did not. The North End became haunted ground, a place where the past clung to the bricks and the air itself seemed to remember. Decades later, historians and activists dug through archives, piecing together what the company wanted buried, pulling the truth back into the public record. They treated the molasses flood not as a curiosity but as a case study in systemic failure, in the corruption of unchecked power. Today, there is a small plaque near the site where the tank once stood. It is easy to miss, just a simple marker noting the disaster and listing the dead. People walk by it every day without stopping. But if you stand there long enough, if you let yourself imagine the sound of the rivets snapping, the roar of the wave, the screams, it becomes something more than a plaque. It becomes a warning. It says, this is what happens when profit is placed above life. This is what happens when warnings are ignored. This is what happens when you trust those in power to do the right thing without forcing them to. And here's where I turn to you. You are not just an observer of this story, you are part of it. Because what happened here is still happening. And if you are watching this right now, I want to know where you are watching from. Comment below with your city or country. Let this become a map of witnesses, a reminder that we are everywhere, that we are watching, and that we do not forget. Because forgetting is how they win, and remembering together is how we make sure they can never hide again. The Great Molasses Flood didn't just leave behind wreckage, it left behind a scar on the legal and political landscape of America. The lawsuits and verdict forced the country to confront something it had never truly faced before. The idea that corporations could be held responsible for mass death. Before 1919, industry was largely untouchable. If a factory collapsed, if workers were maimed, if an entire neighborhood was poisoned, there was little recourse. The system favored production over protection. But this disaster shook that illusion. It was one of the first times in US history that expert testimony about engineering standards, metallurgy, and safety practices was given this much weight in court. It laid the groundwork for modern building codes, industrial safety standards, and liability laws. You see, every regulation we have today, every thickness requirement for steel, every pressure test, every structural inspection was written in blood. Someone had to die first. Someone had to drown in molasses before the government decided that maybe tanks holding millions of gallons of liquid should be tested before being filled. But here's the catch. Even as the law changed, the game stayed the same. Companies adapted. They learned how to protect themselves legally while still taking the same risks. They hired more lawyers, not better engineers. They learned to pay off claims quietly, settle out of court, keep the machine running. So yes, the molasses flood helped force progress, but at a terrible cost. And here's the question I want to put in your mind. Was that progress real? Or was it just the illusion of progress, meant to pacify the public while industry continued to gamble with human lives? Because even now, a century later, we see the same cycle: disaster, outrage, reform, amnesia. And every time, the cost is paid by the same people. The poor, the workers, the voiceless. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a moment in Boston's history. It was a test case for how far they could push, how much death the public would tolerate before demanding change. And they learned something that day. They learned that memory fades. They learned that time erases outrage. They learned that as long as the machine keeps moving, the world will eventually look away. And that is why you cannot. There is something far more sinister hidden beneath the story of the Great Molasses Flood, something psychological, something that reaches into how we are trained to think about disaster. You see, when the wave came, it didn't just crush bodies, it crushed illusions. For a few moments, the people of Boston saw the system for what it really was: indifferent, reckless, willing to kill to protect profit. But almost immediately, the narrative machine went to work, teaching them and all of Usau to process what happened. It told them this was an accident. It told them no one could have predicted it. It told them the price paid was unfortunate but necessary, the natural cost of progress. This is the same lesson you are taught every time there is a tragedy today. The words change: unprecedented, tragic, unforeseeable, but the purpose is the same: to keep you obedient, to make you accept that death on this scale is inevitable, that you have no power to stop it. That is the greatest crime of all, because it rewires your mind. It conditions you to see preventable death as normal, to shrug at injustice, to keep working, keep consuming, keep trusting the very institutions that failed you. The molasses flood wasn't just a physical disaster, it was a psychological experiment. And the results were clear. Most people will accept the official story if it's repeated often enough. Most people will laugh it off if you give them a joke to hide behind. Most people will move on. That is why this story is so dangerous to those in power, because it reveals that we are not powerless. The survivors proved it when they fought for 6 long years and won. They showed that the system can be forced to respond, but only when you refuse to be silent, refuse to be gaslit, refuse to let them dictate what you remember and how you feel about it. If you are still watching this, you are not average. You are someone who wants to see past the illusions. And that is exactly what we're going to do, because the deeper we go, the more you will see that this was not an isolated event. It was a message. A glimpse of the machine that runs everything, and the machine has not stopped. Look around you. 100 years have passed since Boston drowned in molasses, and yet the pattern repeats so perfectly it's almost ritual. When a chemical plant explodes and poisons a town's water supply, they call it an accident. When an oil spill kills thousands of animals and destroys entire coastlines, they say it was unforeseen. When unsafe buildings collapse on factory workers in other countries, they call it a tragedy, send thoughts and prayers, and keep the supply chain moving. This is not coincidence, it is the modern version of the same machine that stood behind purity distilling. And it still works, because the psychology of obedience has not changed. you are still trained to trust the experts they choose, to accept the payout they decide is fair, to forget after the news cycle ends. They still flood you with distractions, jokes, and new headlines until the rage dies. That is why stories like the Molasses Flood matter, because they break the illusion that this is new, that this is just bad luck. It is not bad luck. It is design. Every major disaster becomes a test. How quickly will the public forget? How cheaply can the damage be paid off? How little accountability will be demanded? If you think I'm exaggerating, look at Flint, Michigan, where lead-tainted water was allowed to flow for years while officials lied to residents. Look at chemical spills in East Palestine, Ohio. Look at how fast the outrage burned out, how fast the cameras left, how quickly it became just another headline buried under the next crisis. The North End was the prototype of this cycle. The people who survived the Molasses Flood lived in a world that told them they were lucky to be alive, that they should accept their losses and move on. But they didn't. They fought. And that fight is why you know this story today, why you are sitting here descending into the darkness with me. If they had stayed silent, this would have been erased completely. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. When the next disaster comes and it will you forget, like they want you to? Or will you be the one who refuses, who remembers, who demands to know who built the bomb before it went off? Because the flood was not the end of the story. It was the warning of what was to come. This is where the descent becomes personal. Because if you've stayed with me this long, you already feel it's the weight of this story, the sense that it's not just about the past, it's about you. The Great Molasses Flood is a mirror, and what you see in it is the uncomfortable truth that you live in the same system, under the same rules, under the same hierarchy of power. The names have changed, the products have changed, but the logic has not. Profit first, life second. And if that doesn't disturb you, you aren't looking closely enough. Imagine standing on Commercial Street in 1919, hearing the rivets snap like gunfire, watching that wall of black liquid rise up and blot out the light. You don't have time to run. You don't have time to scream. The wave is already on you. That is how disaster works. It comes faster than you think, and by the time you see it, it is too late. But here is the secret they don't want you to know. The wave is always building long before it breaks. The warnings are always there: groaning tanks, leaking rivets, whistleblowers, strange smells, strange silences. They count on you to ignore them. They count on you being too distracted, too tired, too busy to notice until the catastrophe is upon you. The people of the North End noticed. They complained. They begged for action, and they were ignored. That is the part that should haunt you. This wasn't fate, it was foreseen. It was a disaster with a clock ticking down, and the ones with power decided not to stop it. If that makes your blood boil, good. It should, because the same clock is ticking somewhere right now. Somewhere a tank is leaking, a pipe is corroding, a safety report is being buried. Somewhere a decision is being made to risk lives because it will save money. And when the wave comes, they will tell you it was unforeseeable. They will tell you no one could have known. But you will know. You will remember this moment. You will remember this story. And you will not accept their lies. So here we are at the end of the street, standing where the flood once swept away homes, horses, and human lives. The molasses is gone, but the stain remains, not just on the cobblestones of Boston, but on the conscience of every generation that came after. This story is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to wake you up, Because history's darkest crimes are not locked in the past, they are blueprints. The Great Molasses Flood is the blueprint for every time a corporation gambles with lives and calls it progress. For every time an authority lies to protect its own power. For every time the truth is buried beneath a sticky, suffocating wave of excuses. And here's the final truth. If you forget, if you look away, the cycle wins. That's why we tell this story. That's why you watched until the end. Because now you know, and knowing means you have a choice. You can close this video, shake it off, scroll to the next distraction, or you can carry this knowledge with you, sharpen it like a weapon, and refuse to be lulled back to sleep. The people who stood knee-deep in molasses in 1919 did not have the luxury of forgetting. Neither should you. If this story shook you, if it made you feel something heavy in your chest, let it stay there. Let it remind you that the world you live in is fragile, and the ones who built it are not as careful as they should be. You are the last line of defense against the next disaster. Remember the sound of the rivets snapping. Remember the wave rising higher. Remember the people swallowed whole. And never let anyone tell you it was just an accident. If you've made it this far, comment "I will not forget" twice below so I know you are one of us, the ones who see through the noise. Then like this video, share it with someone who needs to wake up, and subscribe for more forbidden history and untold truths. The story of the Great Molasses Flood is not over. The next wave is coming. Be ready when it hits.